Hello, and welcome to another session of Coffee Talk. My name is Scotty Williams, and I'm the pastor of All Souls Protestant Church, the community that hosts this discussion that happens twice a month. And for Coffee Talk, it's a time where we have a guest and we engage an issue or just a topic that is relevant to the church, relevant to Christian life and faith, and just relevant to society in general. Our guest today is the Reverend Dr. Brien Aadland, who's been with us before. And what did we talk about the last time you were with us?
Well, thanks for having me back on, Scotty. It's always good talking with you. I think what we talked about before was why people are leaving the church,
Yes.
and kind of, I mean, it's not just a easy hour and a half thing. It's a multi-layer faceted thing. So that was interesting. So, and we could talk about that, like I said, for hours. But let's put a pin in that for now.
Yes, and for those who don't know, who are new to Coffee Talk, for the this is your first Coffee Talk that you've checked out. Brien is a pastor slash curator. He has some special. What would you call yourself?
I like to say that I'm a curator of important talks, just because so many people are allergic or triggered by pastors and
Yeah.
that kind of terminology. So we do a lot of looking out of the Bible and reading out of the
Okay.
Bible, but we just to use more, I guess, sensitive words to people. So curator, and we're called Doubters Believers Alliance because um, it's not about trying to get somebody to be a Christian or believe in Jesus, but to have an open mind when it comes to things of faith and spirituality, because we're all on our journey of our own faith and spirituality. And if I can help steer you in any direction, that's what I want to do.
Marvelous. Yes. And I encourage you all who are looking into this to check out the Doubters Believers Alliance. Just type it in, Doubters Believers Alliance, Minneapolis, Minnesota, and that is where Brien is the curator. And it's a wonderful community. It's not your typical church, but it's a place of dialogue and a place of community and a place of fellowship. And I had the privilege of communing with them back in July, and it's amazing the things that you're doing. And as always, I pray blessings upon you all at the Doubters Believers Alliance, Brien.
Thank you. I appreciate it.
So, with all that said, I think we should get started. And the topic that I want to look at today is actually, well, it's less of a topic and more about a person. And that person is someone that you and I hold dear, and that is Dietrich Bonhoeffer or Bonhoeffer. And the reason I want to talk with you about him is what inspired this talk was that the last few days, last 4 days, I was in Berlin and at a conference for international pastors. And during this conference, we took a tour of Bonhoeffer's house, and we just really delved into his theology. We were talking about post-pandemic church, and after going to Bonhoeffer's house, after having the tour, after rereading some of his thoughts in a service, we began to say that the most relevant theologian of our time, if there is one, the one that everyone needs to be looking at, is Bonhoeffer. And I remember in seminary, you were the one who got me into reading Bonhoeffer, because at that time, everyone was either reading John Piper, the more reformed conservative folks, and then everyone else is reading Bonhoeffer, and also Karl Barth as well. And so I wanted to go against the grain, and I was reading Zwingli. And then you came to me one day quoting Bonhoeffer, and I went, oh, not you too. But you encouraged me to get this book by Eric Metaxas, on Bonhoeffer. And I read it, and it just really inspired me. And whenever I think of Bonhoeffer, I think of you. And so just our past in seminary, and then the recent visit to his house, and then the issues we've been engaging, where the church is going, where the church finds herself, I thought we should talk about Bonhoeffer. So starting off, I want to ask, can you tell our listeners, the people looking in, who was Dietrich Bonhoeffer?
Dietrich Bonhoeffer, how long do you want me to go with that? Dietrich Bonhoeffer was a German. I don't remember exactly what town or city he was from, but he came from actually a pretty wealthy family. I want to say his dad was a physician or something like that. And then his mom, I don't know what his mom did, but money was not really an issue for him. He did not grow up like in the slums or in the streets, was well educated. I think his siblings were well educated too. And we had talked before we're starting to record, that he wasn't really raised in the church or raised within Christianity. He came into this
Yep.
later. You said his dad was more agnostic and his mom was a pietist, but not really practicing, any said kind of faith. So he came into it afterwards. And he was someone who obviously, lack of a better phrase, felt that call, felt that pull to do ministry back then in the 30s, I want to say 20s or 30s. And people need to realize Dietrich Bonhoeffer, he died in 1945. I want to say he was born early 1900s because he was, want to say our age or maybe a little older when he was killed. But yeah, got a call into ministry, did his master's, did his PhD. He was teaching education, theology in the universities of Germany. He was a devout Lutheran, which was pretty much, in essence, the state church of Germany at the time. But what really got him in trouble, and probably what we'll probably focus a lot on, was he was an outright critic of the Nazi regime,
Yep.
and why he's kind of so known throughout Christianity, not just evangelical Christianity, but Protestant Christianity, is he stood up he stood up when he knew he could get killed. I don't think he ever thought he was a martyr, but a lot of what he talked about in his ethics, his book on ethics, when, Hitler and the Nazis came in and tried to eradicate pretty much everything, they always stood up and said what Hitler and Nazi was doing, and the Nazism whole ideology was doing was antithetical to the Christian faith and all this stuff. So he had a huge target on his back. I'm sure he had family, friends telling him to just knock it off, to be quiet, like this is going to get you killed. But why Bonhoeffer is so well loved is he talked the talk and he walked the walk. And many people don't do that. If I was in his situation, would I have been that emboldened within my faith, or would I have been scared to be like, oh, I have my, my family I'd have to think about? And I know I'm kind of doing like a 30,000 foot view here, but
Okay.
yeah. So he was a great, I don't know, martyr, prophet, spy, theologian, all around just awesome dude.
Yeah, when you mentioned that, how he stood up to the Nazi regime, one of a quote came to mind from one of the pastors that was at this conference I attended a few days ago. And the quote was about temptation. And what he said is he said, there are times where the tempter is out in a non-sacred place with horns on his head. He said, but then there comes a time where the tempter is within the church with a halo on his head. And I felt like, with Bonhoeffer, that's how it was during his time. That something had this thing, Nazism, but not just Nazism. There were other unhealthy things that entered the church and made the church a place of temptation. And then you had and yeah, the tempters in the church. And the biggest temptation in Bonhoeffer's day was to be comfortable, was to go along with the status quo, make your money, build up your pension, um, you know, give some nice messages and see the smiling faces in the pews, and then retire with relative ease. And I wonder, because this pastor who said this about the tempter sometimes being in the church and having a halo. Um, the question came up after he said this: are we in a time like the time of Bonhoeffer? Are we in a time where the tempter is heavily in the church and is wearing a halo instead of horns? If you get what I mean, what do you think
Mm-hmm.
about this? Do you think that the church is in a similar place today as it was in Bonhoeffer's time?
I mean, the one caveat that I'll say that's extremely different, which I know you and all of the listeners will say, is we're not in a time of war. We're not
Yeah.
in time of evil dictators, Nazism. I'm sure there's dictators around the world, but by and large, most of European Christianity, American Christianity, Christianity in the South, like the Southern Hemisphere, we're not experiencing any sort of we wouldn't die for our faith. I know there's parts of the world that they would,
Hmm.
but so that part is drastically different than the time of Bonhoeffer. But as far as kind of being tempted, using that analogy you did that Bonhoeffer said is, yeah, I would agree with that fully, like 100%, because so often I've heard growing up in the church, because much like you, we kind of were born into Christianity, so to say, and you're always looked upon you always look upon this pastor, and you hear their schooling. I went to this Bible college or this university, I went into seminary to get my master's degree of divinity, or I got my doctorate of ministry or my PhD. And you're like, yes, they should, we love that they're the leaders of our church and pillars of our community and things like that. But I think there is a huge pull within Christianity to almost make the job of a pastor is the same as anything else, the same as a CEO of a company, the same as, a mail carrier. Like, it's a job, this is your career, um, whatever. But I feel like there's so much more to being a pastor, to being someone called of God. It's a 24-hour, 7 days a week job, 365. Your phone's always on. And I'm not a pastor of a traditional church. I mean, our church meets in a bar, for crying out loud. But my phone's always on, so people from our community can call. People from my own job that I do 40 hours a week in a very secular, institution. But I think to get more at your question, I think everyone who goes into ministry, every minister, no matter whatever denomination they are, they kind of come out of, it's almost like using the analogy when you get out of college and you're just on fire. You're like, yes, I'm going to go into this field. I'm going to nail it. You have all this passion and all this desire, and you're 5-10 years into whatever field, business world, art world, whatever. And then you hit a wall and you're like, what? It's like, you start to get this unveiling, this revelation. And it's usually you read something or you hear horror stories or you just see it yourself and you're like, I just drank this Kool-Aid. I just, I was, you just see all the crap that happened while you were in it. And then you feel trapped and you feel stuck. And then you want to say, hey, how do I get out of this? Bonhoeffer dealt with that within his own Lutheran Christianity, and even with the own Lutheran people in Germany. There's a lot of Lutheran ministers in Germany who drank the Kool-Aid, who
Yeah.
sided with Hitler, even though they knew Hitler was wrong. They're like, because they would say, oh, my life, my church, my pension, my money is more important than standing up for what's right. And I think so often in the church, even currently now, people care more about their own personal income, their own personal spot within the community, how many books they can write, how many articles they can get published, how many places they can preach or teach. And it's become less about teaching the message of Jesus. And that is the crux. I tell people all the time, the crux of Christianity is to teach the teachings of Jesus. And to me,
Mm.
everything else is just kind of outliers. And that's my take. And I'm not putting words in anybody else's mouth, but that is the crux of the gospel, is to tell people about what Jesus did, his teachings, how he lived his life. And so often in so many churches, it's not even about that anymore.
Yeah, like when you mentioned that feeling of when you go into ministry, this, you're on fire, this zeal. Every pastoral conference I've been to, even this recent one, you'll hear someone say, over and over again, I have to remind myself of why I entered this. I entered this ministry not for respectability. I entered it out of reverence for Christ and reverence for his message, and something about Jesus and who he is touched my heart and transformed me, and I wanted to shout and tell the whole world about it and devote my life to it and let it be the center of everything I say and do. And then you enter into the church, and up comes, or you get into ministry more and more, and then there's this temptation to be all about respectability rather than reverence. And that's what I noticed in Bonhoeffer's theology. And this is what they said on the tour, is that, the German church at the time of Bonhoeffer, um, even before World War One, German society throughout the West, there was industrialization going on. And so you had society was going from agrarian to industrial. They were going from being on farms to being in cities. And you started seeing cities expanding and building up. And cities at the time, it was all about respectable professions. What was a respectable profession? A doctor, a lawyer, a psychiatrist, who was in these inner circles. And the churches previous to that, throughout the Western world, they were more rooted in village life. The image of the church was, I call it the church in the snow globe that you see, if you have those snow globes, this like small community with the steeple and this place of rest and warm feelings, and also even what the pastor was called. Most pastors, and we used to use this word in the US, they were called parsons. I don't know if you remember that term. Um, in the song "Walking in a Winter Wonderland," in the meadow we will build a snowman and pretend that he is Parson Brown. Pastors,
Oh,
yeah, the
I skipped right
pastor,
over that.
yeah, and pastors used to be called parsons, and parson is from the Latin. It's the Latin word for person. And so the perspective, or the view of the pastor, the view of the church was, it wasn't this respectable thing. It was a place of reverence, and the pastor's job was about reverence and following the way of Jesus. Well, then, as the churches are looking at all of these institutions getting respectable, it got caught up in the temptation to be respectable, and churches start building edifices. Because I was surprised to learn, at least here, in Europe, there are a lot of these huge churches, and you think, okay, these big churches, they were built in 500-600 years ago, and they were actually built in like the late 1800s, early 1900s, many of them. and even after the world wars. And it was this idea of respectability and the pastor being a respectable person and just being a professional. And with respectability comes influence. With respectability comes power. With respectability comes comfort. And Bonhoeffer faced all of these things. And you can really see it, him writing against respectability in Cheap Grace versus Costly Grace. Can you elaborate on that? Because I've been talking a lot, but with respectability and cheap grace, explain to our listeners, our viewers, what Bonhoeffer meant by that.
You're making me go back through my brain, and it's super early here in the morning. So compared to where it's at in Switzerland, got to get my thinking cap on.
You have your coffee with you?
I do. I have my iced coffee, which I want to say to the listeners, I love oat milk. I thought it was going to be terrible, and I am a fan of oat milk. It's wonderful and delicious.
Sadly, I have no coffee, and this is coffee talk.
Yeah, so shame on you.
Yeah.
I have cold brew. I'm really into cold brew. Anyway, I think if I can remember fully kind of encapsulating it, cheap grace than costly grace. Costly grace is going to cost you something. It's going to change your life radically. I'm sure most people know what happened to Bonhoeffer. Bonhoeffer got caught by the Nazis, by the Gestapo. We can talk about how he tried to bomb Hitler. He was part of a group that did that. But it was grace that cost him something. Cheap grace is what I think most pastors in most churches today do. They talk about grace. They peddle it. Yes, grace is something that's in the Bible. Grace is something that we need to talk about. Grace is something that Jesus shows us, offers us. We're supposed to do the same. But
can I interject real quick? Because some people might not know what grace is. Grace is God's favor. It's God's favor and God's blessing. And it's a gift of God. So it's God's favor and blessing that we can't earn. Yeah, because some people might not know what grace is.
And it's given to everyone.
Yes.
Regardless of who you are or what you've done. But I feel it's so much in the church, and like I said, this is church universal, all denominations. We talk about it, and I know some very prominent people who are online doing online ministry stuff, who are, people in regular churches, and they'll talk about grace. They were shown grace, but then they don't show grace to anybody. And that's cheap grace. That grace is you can write a book about grace and it could be a top seller. That's cheap grace, in my opinion, because I feel like so often in Christianity, we talk about words and like grace and sanctification and love and acceptance and inclusion. And they're just buzzwords to so many people and that's cheap because it's easy to talk about. It's easy to be like, oh yeah, we're an inclusive church. Oh yeah, we're a church full of grace. But then when push comes to shove, where you're actually, supposed to show it, you fail miserably at it. And Bonhoeffer, when he said costly grace is, like you said, that gift that God gives you, that love that God gives you, that favor God gives you, but it's going to cost you something. And it might cost you a job, it might cost you a relationship, or it might even cost you your life, which it ultimately did for Bonhoeffer.
Yeah, that's the thing about it. It's like cheap grace is priceless. Both graces are priceless. Cheap grace is priceless. Costly grace is priceless, but priceless in a different way. Cheap grace is priceless because it costs you nothing. And it doesn't change you. It doesn't transform you. It leaves you in the same place. And I think this is why the church in Bonhoeffer's day had the problems that it did, and the church in our day has the problems that it has, because we have this grace that isn't transformative. So you start seeing the problems in the world in the church, and you start saying, how is this different? You start seeing the narcissism that you see in the business world, or the corporate world. You start seeing it among ministers. You start seeing the bullying that happens, in different institutions, happening in the church. You start seeing the exclusion, the unjust exclusion happening in the church. You start seeing this worldliness going on. It's a priceless grace, because it costs you nothing. It doesn't transform you. But then that costly grace is priceless, because there's nothing you can do to earn it. The only thing that you can do is live in response to it.
Mm-hmm.
And that grace it calls you to be transformed. It calls you to become a different person. It calls you to have to turn from the things of this world and worldly ways of doing, and follow this way of Jesus, which is about humility and service and justice. And you see, and like you said, in Bonhoeffer, in his day, he emphasized that. And the tragedy is that the church didn't listen. But then here's the other thing. At this conference I was at, we also were honoring Saint Francis of Assisi, because his feast day was quite recent. So we had a service where we sang All Creatures of Our God and King, and did Lectio Divina, this form of Bible study that Francis loved. But just like Bonhoeffer, Francis believed, that there was cheap grace and costly grace. And, and it was a similar situation in his day. And he called the church to this costly grace, and he suffered for it. And like this leads me to question number 3. We have 4 questions that we're exploring today, by the way. So question number 3, and that is, as we've talked about the cost that Bonhoeffer had to pay, that St. Francis paid, and the cost he paid was he was excluded. He was kicked out of his home. His father put him out. He was laughed at by the church. He really struggled. What do you think is the cost of grace for us today? What might be some of the cost?
Say it again. I want to make sure I get everything you said.
So we've sort of highlighted, mentioned the cost that Bonhoeffer paid in his time for grace. Then we've looked at the cost. I mentioned some of the costs that Francis of Assisi paid.
Sure.
What are the, and I'm going to add something to this. It seems like the cost that they paid were the same. Like the cost of grace never changes. That St. Francis faced exclusion, and he was belittled by the church. He went against the grain of the world. He lived on the margins. And then also for Bonhoeffer was the same. I was surprised to learn, by the way, that he pastored a lot out. Most of his pastoring, or the bulk of it, was outside of Germany, because he was in England, and then he was in the U.S.
And he was in a black.
He was in a black church in the U.S., the Abyssinian Baptist Church, and he taught Sunday school there, and he was there during the time of segregation in the United States, and he wanted no part with the mainline churches, or the mainstream churches that segregated. And so he, like Francis, had to, the cost was living on the margins in a way. What do you think, in light of the cost that they paid, are our costs today? Are they the same? Is there a difference? Like, what are your thoughts?
Yeah, I don't think it's an easy yes and no answer. I do think, and this is my hot take, once again, Church Universal. I think every pastor, every person in ministry gets caught up in well, what about me? What about me? What are my next steps? How am I gonna, I went to school for all this education. I say that all the time. Like, I have a doctorate of ministry. I have a master's of Christian thought. I've spent countless hours, you know, writing and sleepless nights coming up and, doing all these things for the ministry and for Jesus. And what about me? What about me? What about me? Me. And I'm not saying it's wrong to try to take care of yourself or your family,
Mhm.
but you're literally entering into a field where it's not about you,
Yep. Hmm.
where it's about everything about other people. It's always giving of yourself. And that's why I love the analogy when people are like, God or Christ is like a physician and is like a doctor, because that's literally what doctors and physicians do. It's not about them, it's about you. Like, you need to come to me for help. You need to
Yep.
come for me to help. It's like you're always out there helping others. And so often, especially in America, only speaking as an American myself, is so often the church has been less about the pastors going into the community. And I'm not going to say this as like a full, this is what all pastors do, because there's a lot of pastors who are out in the community helping, charitable, all these things. So I don't want anybody to get confused. But by and large, a lot of people, especially I've noticed in mainline Christianity in the States, they will talk this talk, they'll be woke, they'll be social justice driven, they'll do all these things. And then, but when it comes to it costs them something,
Hmm.
they remain silent. If it costs them,
Hmm.
and I've had people say to me, oh, I can't be as outspoken as you are about the church and the critiques because I would lose my job. And that's to me, this is like that cheap grace, that cheap faith. Is if you're living a faith and if you're living something that you can't do anymore. Like, we don't hear pastors that much anymore being like, yeah, I was a part of filling the denomination, and they were speaking stuff that I could not get behind, that my theology just couldn't get there, like the doctrines were weird. You don't hear people being like, I had to leave. I had to just be like, I'm done. I'm out of it. You don't hear people say that anymore because their whole life is immersed and enmeshed in that denomination. And it's like, and that's why I have a huge sometimes issue with just denominations, is because, is it about Jesus or is it about this church? And,
Or you.
and there's nothing wrong with denominations. I don't have an issue with that. For me, I just can't stand on the dotted line with denominations, because I was like, back in Jesus's time, it's like we didn't have the Lutherans, we didn't have the Catholics, we didn't have the Baptists. That's all something that humans did, because we all understand Jesus in different ways, and that's fine, I guess, too. But the big
Mhm.
thing, like, we don't hear people like Assisi anymore, or Bonhoeffer anymore, or even, let's say, like a Mother Teresa. All these people did great things. Did they have warts? Did they have bad things or dumb things that they did? Yes, they're human beings. But you don't hear about these people that much anymore, is because people do not want to, what's the word? People don't want to live that. They want to live in a life of quote unquote luxury. And I'm not talking about luxury like fancy mansions or car, or all these things, but they want a house. They want to have a picket fence. They want to have their kids. They want to have a car that's reliable. They want to get groceries from wherever they are. People like Bonhoeffer and Assisi, they didn't know where their next meal is going to come from. They didn't know, what was happening. They didn't know if they were going to get killed. Assisi, literally, if people know about St. Francis, he was royalty in essence. Like, his father was rich. His father was a silk merchant. He had anything and everything that he wanted, and he realized this is all meaningless. This is all pointless. He had this great encounter with God, and he lived a life of utter poverty, because he's like, this is how I'm going to find God. This is how I'm going to find the Christ. Not with all these things. And Bonhoeffer ended up getting killed for standing up, because Bonhoeffer's famous quote, I'm going to probably hack it up, but if you remain silent in the form or in the face of evil, then you're perpetuating that evil.
Yeah.
Meaning, if you don't stand up when something wrong is happening, especially as a Christian or as a pastor, if you're not standing up and saying that it's wrong, you are that evil. And I feel like so often in the church and as ministers, we take the easy road out, and we always think about me, but yet we realize what about all those stories in the Bible about suffering, Job, Jonah, all these things that we read about people who are prophets or teachers of God. They go through all this junk, and then somehow we think that's never going to happen to us. God's never going to do that.
Yeah. It's interesting, when you mentioned, like, it's just as you were mentioning these things, I also thought that what we, I don't think it's that we don't hear these voices, people like that. What we've done is we sanitize those voices, or when a Bonhoeffer starts to rise up, this is where the tempter plays in now. And I was discussing this, at the conference as well with these other pastors. They were like, it seems like today when a radical voice, a Bonhoeffer, rises up, the tempter comes along, or someone comes along and makes them famous. And then their message, which had this radical edge of costly grace, all of a sudden it becomes sanitized and acceptable. And we've done this to Bonhoeffer because, I mean, let's be honest, Bonhoeffer, the place where he's quoted the most is the so-called woke, justice-driven churches. They have feast days. His statues are on buildings and stuff like that. Or Francis of Assisi, the same thing. And
you find them in all of our gardens.
Yeah, he's in our
His
garden.
little statue.
Yep. And so, we used to be in the business of cleaning people up when they were dead. Now we're in the business of quickly cleaning them up while they're living. Making, and like, when a Bonhoeffer rises up, and it makes me, it breaks my heart to see that. It breaks my heart to watch the transformation of leaders, people that I've been looking up to, going, wow, this is a powerful voice. Then they get to a point where the comfort is presented to them, and the cheap grace is presented, and they take it and they become like everybody else. And but then I also get scared for myself, because it's like you in your ministry, I faced the tempter in my own. And I think you constantly face it throughout your life as a pastor or your life as a Christian. You constantly come to this fork in the road. Will you take the cheap grace, or will you take that costly grace? And there's this fear in me where I'm like, as I'm choosing more and more this path of costly grace, I'm just praying like, God, don't let me get to a point where I get domesticated, shall we say, where I start toning the message down and watering it just so that I can become respectable. Yeah.
If I can just chime in too, kind of, so if people don't know my story fully, we kind of briefly went over it, but I was almost went into the Assemblies of God, which is Pentecostal denomination, but I left because of their theology. And I just couldn't sign on the dotted line. I had a brief love affair with the Baptist church, but then, I became UCC and I wanted to sign on the dotted line, and I love their theology. And I remember, Scotty, you talking to me years ago and being like, yeah, I think this is right for you. And, all this stuff. And then I started finding out, oh, this person that I know is UCC, or that person I know is UCC. And there are a lot of great people within the United Church of Christ that I know and I'm still friends with. But why I couldn't sign on the dotted line with them is I finally realized in my own head, I had this self-realization, is that I couldn't be A, the Christian, B, the minister, C, how I feel like God wants me to communicate God's love to the community around me in a way that made sense to the United Church of Christ.
Hmm.
Because it was like, to most of them, it was like, oh, you could be a chaplain in a university, you could be a chaplain in a hospital, you could be a parish minister, you could be a UCC, but like marriage family therapy. But when I said I wanted to be more of like a public theologian, not really have a church building, I wanted to bring younger people in, like college age. I want to have church in a bar. And when I started talking about stuff like this, just the blank look of confusion of all this stuff, and it made me realize, it was like this voice in the back of my head, which, call it the Holy Spirit, maybe my conscience, I don't know, but I felt like it was just being like, Brien, if you sign on this dotted line, it's easy, you're going to find a job way easier, you're going to have a pension, you're going to have being taken care of your whole entire rest of your life. And how much more easier is that going to be for your family, for yourself? But I don't like to do the easy things. You know me quite well.
Yeah.
I don't do things that are easy because that's just not in my DNA. And so, but leaving the United Church of Christ was a difficult decision because I was in it for 8 years. But both my wife and my own family, my own brother and mother, were like, you are such a different person now that you left. You're more happy, you're more passionate, and you can attest to this. God speaks to us and does things in funky, weird ways that we have no idea why he does it.
Hmm.
And all these little things are happening for me post leaving, quote unquote ordainable denominational call. More like, I don't get charged in the bar that I meet anymore for our DBA. They just stopped charging me.
Hmm.
And it was only $25 a week, which isn't a lot, but they're like, you're like family to us. We love it. And this is like a non-Christian secular place. I mean, you've been there. It's a staple in the Minneapolis, kind of community. And they're coming, like, we have a very small group, and they're like, you're family to us. We love you guys. We love your wife and your daughter and the community that you bring in. You don't have to pay us rent anymore. What? I mean, I can't even go into a UCC church down the street and be like, hey, can I use your building free of charge for every Sunday? No. Why would you ask that? But yet this bar, a very popular bar in the Minneapolis area, is like, hey, we have nothing going on back there. Why don't you use our theater room for free every Sunday?
Hmm.
So,
Yeah.
and I always tell people, God doesn't just work in churches. You don't just feel the divine in church. And I know you know this, but I think everyone needs to hear every now and then, God works wherever God's spirit wants to work. If he wants
Yep.
to work in a church, he can. God wants to work, you're out on a nature walk with your family or by yourself, you read a book and you find the divine in that, or you talk to people over a glass of beer in a pub, you can find God there. And I'm finding God in so many awesome and rich places. And maybe that's going back to Bonhoeffer and his CC, is they understood that. They understood that it was easier to stick into the normal quote unquote daily lives that they were living. But when you walk away and into the unknown, it's going to be a lot more scary and a lot more costly, but it's where you need to be.
Yeah. And like, before we get to the last question, because this is a perfect segue, as we talk about these things to our listeners about pensions and stuff like that, there's nothing wrong with a pension. There's nothing wrong
No,
with wanting a house and things, because I think about the motivation of, because even Bonhoeffer, this is the interesting part I learned about him is, when I went to this house, like usually you expect someone like him to be like living in like a closet somewhere, pinned up and living off of, peanut butter and cold soup out the can, something like that. Or bread and water. And Bonhoeffer, the guy liked to smoke. He liked nice clothes. The house we were in was a normal house for his day. He was of noble stock as well. His mother had von in her name, VON, which in German, von, whatever, is the sign of nobility. You went into his room, and even though it was like an attic room, it was fairly comfortable. There was enough space in there for a second bed, which one of his co-workers, one of his friends, when he'd stay over, would crash in the room with him. And even I got to sit in his chair. It's a very comfortable chair. So there's nothing wrong with, comforts in life in and of themselves. But
True.
When that becomes your focus, when you say, Jesus is a means to an end, the gospel is a means to me getting that pension. The gospel is a means for me to get that nice house. The gospel is a means for me to get these things, rather than seeing these things as a part of that grace, that free gift, God's blessing that you don't deserve. Then it's a problem. And that's what I think is the issue. That's where ministry has kind of gone off the rails in our era. Is, I was talking with a pastor, an older colleague, not too long ago, and this older colleague is in the baby boomer generation, and they're looking at me as, they thought I was a Gen Z person. I said, no, I'm actually an older millennial, a zennial, or somebody had the nerve to call us geriatric millennials. It just sounds so bad.
How dare they? How dare they?
How dare you?
We're in our 30s and we're geriatric. Okay.
Yeah, but I told her, I said, and so then they said, well, even though you're not in this generation that's mad at me, he's like, I want to apologize because we really messed things up. We saw the gospel as a means to an end, rather than using different ends for the sake of the gospel and living out of the gospel. And then this colleague said to me, what bothers them the most is when they will meet other colleagues their age who are apologetic, or not apologetic, but who have some remorse about the state of things in the church. They'll hear, well, but at least I'm thankful that I can retire and I have my pension. I'm thankful at least. And he looked and said, you still don't get it. That's still that cheap grace at work. He was like, what we should be doing is to say, even though I'm in retirement, or even though I'm in my last years of ministry, before that pension comes, I need to be trying to correct the damage that's been done. And I need to be saying, look at my life as an example, using my life as a warning to say, this isn't what it's all about. It's about this message of Jesus. And when you follow it, and I found this every time I come to the fork in the road of cheap and costly grace, every time I meet the tempter, whether it's in a sacred space or a secular space, every time, I make that choice for the costly grace, I'm blown away beyond my wildest dreams. Like you said, opportunities come up, new ways of thinking come up. And I've seen my goal as a minister now, I could sit, you could as well, and just be critical of the state of things. And Bonhoeffer could have sat and just been a cynic in his attic, but cynics aren't catalysts. They're just disgruntled people. But what Bonhoeffer did is and this is also what that costly grace does. Costly grace doesn't allow you to be a cynic. It doesn't allow you to condemn the people on the wrong way. It calls you to respond to them with love and to invite them, to something better, invite them to something more wonderful. And this brings us to this last question that I want to ask, and that's about Bonhoeffer's religionless Christianity. We're going there. And this was the thing he invited the church into from this place of cheap grace and respectability. Is he said, you know, he goes, if you want to recapture what Jesus was talking about and get that power back in faith that changes the world, that transforms you, that pulls people in and makes them want to, you know, give their all for it. He called the church to religionless Christianity. And so, can you explain to our viewers in we'll say 6 minutes, because we're almost at the end, what is religionless Christianity?
That's a gosh. I should have. If you just told me about this yesterday, I feel like I should have prepped more. Putting me on the spot.
This makes the best conversations.
Yeah, I guess so. Or your listeners are going to be like, "What is this guy talking out of?" I feel like a lot what he's trying to say with that is, if you're wanting that transformative understanding of Christ's love for, you know, all people, the communities, and other, you have to do it without the guise of religion. You have to do it without any prohibitions, any things that you come up against. I always explain to people, like, religion kills, but the love of God and Christ's teaching transcends all. And I just think, and it's still so hard when you talk to people about Christianity, because they're like, well, isn't Christianity a religion? And you're like, well, technically it is, but I tell people, I think, and you know, all great teachers, or not all great teachers, but a lot of teachers, their thoughts have been turned into religions because the more and more people follow them. But I said, I really think Christ had this ethic of love, and his ethic of in his teaching. And so, I mean, look at Bonhoeffer wrote on ethics. His whole thing was how to live an ethical life, but his ethic was founded on the principles of Jesus Christ and the teachings of Jesus. So it was this whole transformative thing. And I feel like religionless Christianity is, how can we practice the teachings of Jesus? How can we live out the message of Jesus without, quote unquote, being a religion, or quote unquote even having this church building and the form and functions and policies? And I'm not going to say to anybody that going to church is wrong, going into a church building is right or wrong. I'm not trying to say that, but I think we get so caught up under the ritualism, we get so caught up on all the sacramental things, which none of those things are wrong, but we get caught up on it and we miss the transformative, uh, mystical, just the
Just say
nonsensical.
spirit filled. You know, you
Yeah,
want to say spirit
spirit
filled.
filled. Well, and I've talked to people, the outpouring of God and love and all that stuff. It's nonsensical. It's absurd, and I'm not using those in negative terms, but it's absurd how much God loves all of us. It's nonsensical why a deity would do that. And sometimes I feel like you can't understand that crazy, powerful, spirit-filled love that makes no sense stuck inside religion.
Yeah, because,
And I think that's what Bonhoeffer was trying to get at, is we need to get out of all the murkiness of, quote unquote, this is what church is, this is what religion is, this is what church is, this is what religion is. And was like, no, there's a better way to understand that. Let's put those out aside. I mean, what did he do? He started, what it was at the underground seminary up in Finkenwalde, where he did it, you know, people don't do that anymore, but there was so much transformative, loving things. And he didn't do it with the church's blessing. He didn't do it with other theological blessings. He just did it.
Yeah. You know,
know?
when you mention like religionless Christianity as well, he wasn't saying, you know, get rid of rituals or anything like that, or tradition. He was like, But any place where these things become a hindrance or a stumbling block to the way, the life that we are called to live, get rid of it.
Right.
And in his day, he said the solution, I'm paraphrasing him, and hopefully I'm capturing his thoughts. But he said in his day, what was needed, because it's different for every age. In Francis of Assisi's day, it was going back and rebuilding these abandoned chapels and starting religious orders, the Franciscans,
Mm-hmm.
and living, a vow of poverty and chastity. But in Bonhoeffer's day, he saw it as the churches. He was like, these edifices that we've been building, we need to close them down. And he was like, and literally make the church something that's hard to find. Take the church. He's like, take the church from being so visible and make it something that is hard to find. And he was like, and the people who want it and want that radical love of Jesus, and want the transformative, spirit-filled, outpouring of God, the gospel. He was like, those people will search for it with all their life till they find it. And then he said, then it creates a new way of being Christian, because it'll no longer just be creeds or holy deeds. It will just be this way of life characterized by love. You won't feed people because it's Christmas and that's what Christians do. You'll feed people just because, and you won't say, well, it's what Jesus would wanted me to do. It will be so ingrained in you that you'll do it just because.
Mm-hmm.
And like, and it's sad, to think that, like, he, because I remember when I read about his religionless Christianity, there was part of me that just went, this is going really far. This is a big stretch. But I wonder now, in hindsight, what would have happened if the Western churches followed what he said? What would have happened? What changed? How powerful would things be? Because you look at it now with many of the Western churches, even the non-denominational ones, and a lot of them have continued this same pattern that Bonhoeffer called out, that Assisi and so many others like them called out, this pattern of cheap grace. And we'll go a little bit over time, because I think we should just make it practical. What are some things that we need to do in our time? What is the religionless Christianity for us? If Bonhoeffer was here, what would he tell us to do practically if he saw us today?
Love without reservation. Don't talk about grace and not living it out. Christ is not just found in the church. Christ isn't just found in the seminaries. Or, the church is supposed to be a place where it's hospitable to everyone. So do that. I'm so frustrated how so many churches and denominations will say, oh, we're hospitable, we're inclusive of all. And then you go into their church, they charge you $5-10 for a plate of food. A homeless person came into my rich, wealthy white church in the city. Bonhoeffer and Assisi would have a field day with those people. We've domesticated Christianity. We've turned it into what we wanted it to be.
Mm-hmm.
And the radical hospitality, the radical love, the radical inclusion that Christ actually demands of followers, we're not living it out. Some do. Some communities, they do. But by and large, we don't. Um, um, this isn't Bonhoeffer, but one person that I've been obsessed with, and I always play around with this idea, was by Brennan Manning, who is a great writer and kind of spiritual Christian thinker. And he wrote something, I don't know if it was in Ragamuffin Gospel, or I think it was like the tenderness of joy or something. And he said, one of the best things that should happen to Christianity is for it to go underground, for it to disappear for 1 whole year, 1 whole year. And after that year, we'll see if it's needed. Because he was
Mhm.
thinking, because he was like, so often the church is like, you need us, you need us, you need us. And it's like, do we need the church, quote unquote, or do we need people that love Jesus? Do we need the this radical love and hospitality? And like you said, I'm not trying to say the church needs to go away. I'm not trying to say rituals or sacraments need to go away. But when those get in the way of accepting people and loving people and doing the things God tells us to do, that's the thing that people like Brendan Manning or St. Francis of Assisi or even Dietrich Bonhoeffer will push against.
Mm.
That's what we need to get for. We when communion is a great thing, baptism is a great thing, but when those become exclusionary, or what your church or your community cares more about than radical love and hospitality, then then you get rid of them. And I think
Yeah.
that's kind of going back and encapsulating religionless Christianity. It's hard to put all this stuff into a 1 hour talk,
No, it's okay,
but
man. Yeah.
yeah, I just think it's so easy for us to take the easy way out. Pastors, ministers, Christians in general, to be the comfortable, to have the comfortability. But like you said, when you were said like taking that fork in the road, and when you always do the costly side, you don't know what's going to happen, but all these great things do end up happening for you. And that's what I want to say to your listeners who listen, is when you take that harder road, but you know it's the right road, in the outcome, in the long run, things are going to work out. I can't tell you how they're going to work out, but I was so scared when I left my ordinational call. I was almost done with it, but my life has never been more happier, more peaceful, more joyful, and I'm seeing God in such cool, mystical, weird ways that I never thought I would have. And so maybe that's religionless Christianity. Maybe that's costly grace, just even in my own life that Bonhoeffer has talked about.
Wow, man. Well, I can't add anything more to that. Like what you said just touched my spirit because it's like, I'm thinking of as I transition from the current call I'm in, I'm starting to think, what do I want my future to look like? Or what's the next type of church I want to be in? And it comes back to I want the next community I serve or the next calling that I go into to be one that is really shaped by that costly grace and one where there is a fellowship of people who who are willing to experience all the things that you talked about. And yeah, man, what you said is very inspiring, and I just want to thank you for this wonderful chat today. Thank you for sharing your wisdom from Bonhoeffer and just for this engaging discussion. And I pray many blessings on you, many blessings on the Doubters Believers Alliance.
Thank you,
And
thank you.
yeah, man. And yeah, and looking forward to another coffee talk where you bless us again with your thoughts. So with that, we're going to end today's chat. Many thanks also to those of you who listened to today's talk, and I hope you were enlightened. If you want to learn more about Dietrich Bonhoeffer, you can look at this book. This book is by Eric Metaxas, and it's on Bonhoeffer, Pastor, Martyr, Prophet, Spy. And don't you have this book, Brien?
Yeah, I would also recommend, if I can, Dietrich Bonhoeffer's book. He just wrote it. It's called Ethics. It's a little weighty, but then he also has a fantastic book called Letters and Papers from Prison, where it's actually letters and papers he wrote to his fiancee at the time and his family from prison. Just really transformative stuff. So those are probably three good books to dig into if you're wanting to dig into his thought and kind of his background.
Wonderful. Well, thank you again, Brien, and many blessings to you and many blessings to our listeners. And check out those resources. You won't be disappointed. So with that, God bless and keep you all, and see you again soon. Ciao, ciao. Bye-bye.